You're not what was promised. The weathered rancher spits at the black mail-order bride stepping off the dusty stagecoach, his eyes scanning her fuller figure with disgust before the entire gathered crowd. Laughter ripples through the frontier town as onlookers shake their heads at the woman clutching her worn satchel. They whisper she'll be on the next stage out, another broken dream swallowed by the unforgiving territory. But from the shadows, a towering, silent cowboy watches with different eyes, seeing strength where others see failure. Unknown to all, he carries secrets that could reshape this harsh community, while she possesses talents that could unlock voices long silenced. Their fates intertwine around a conspiracy threatening everyone they've grown to protect. Will two outcasts find the courage to expose the truth before the corrupt powers crush them both? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly as Evelyn Thompson stepped from the stagecoach onto the dusty main street of Copper Ridge. Her worn leather satchel contained everything she owned in the world. 3 months of correspondence had led her here. 3 months of hope. The gathered crowd fell silent as she smoothed her dark blue dress. Their stares burned hotter than the desert air. She had expected curiosity, perhaps even some skepticism. She had not expected the immediate shift in their expressions from anticipation to disappointment. Jedediah Cole pushed through the crowd, his broad shoulders parting the onlookers like a plow through soil. His weathered face twisted as he took in her appearance. The photograph she had sent months ago showed only her face and shoulders. It had not revealed her fuller figure or darker complexion. "You're not what was promised," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached into her satchel and withdrew the bundle of letters they had exchanged. "Mr. Cole, I believe there has been some misunderstanding. We have corresponded for months about our arrangement." Cole barely glanced at the papers. "No misunderstanding here. You misrepresented yourself, woman." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads in obvious disapproval. Others whispered behind cupped hands. A few children pointed before their mothers pulled them away. "I never lied about anything," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Didn't need to lie outright, did you?" Cole's voice grew louder, playing to his audience. "That picture you sent sure didn't show the whole truth." Heat flooded Evelyn's cheeks. The humiliation cut deeper than any physical blow. She had traveled over 1,000 miles based on their correspondence. She had sold everything she owned back in Philadelphia to afford the journey west. From the edge of the crowd, a massive figure watched the proceedings in silence. Silas Brooks stood nearly a head taller than the other men, his broad frame casting a long shadow across the boardwalk. Unlike the others, his expression showed no mockery or cruel amusement. His dark eyes remained fixed on the woman facing down the hostile crowd. "Pack yourself back on that stage," Cole continued. "Next one leaves tomorrow morning." "Now hold on there, Jedediah," called a woman's voice from the crowd. Ethel Remington emerged from the gathering, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a faded bonnet. She owned the town's boarding house and had seen enough cruelty to last several lifetimes. "This young lady just traveled a considerable distance," Ethel said. "Least we can do is offer her a decent meal and a place to rest before she makes any decisions about her future." Cole's jaw tightened. "She can rest somewhere else. I won't have folks thinking I had anything to do with this deception." Silas Brooks stepped forward, his massive boots echoing on the wooden planks. The crowd parted instinctively before him. He had worked odd jobs around town for years, rarely speaking to anyone. Most folks assumed his silence meant simple thinking. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn and picked up her heavy trunk, as if it weighed nothing. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and she saw something unexpected there. Kindness. Without a word, he began walking toward Ethel's boarding house. The gesture spoke louder than any speech could have. "Much obliged, Silas," Ethel said, falling into step beside Evelyn. "Don't mind the spectacle, dear. This town's got a shortage of entertainment and an abundance of small minds." Evelyn followed the silent giant down the street, her cheeks still burning from the public rejection. Behind them, the crowd began to disperse, their voices carrying speculation and judgment in equal measure. The boarding house stood at the end of Main Street, its white paint peeling, but its windows clean and welcoming. Silas set her trunk on the front porch and touched the brim of his hat before walking away without a sound. "He doesn't talk much," Ethel explained, watching Silas disappear around the corner. "But he's got more decency in his little finger than most folks around here have in their whole bodies." Inside the boarding house, the smell of fresh bread and coffee provided some comfort after the harsh reception. Ethel led her to a small room on the second floor overlooking the street. "I can't pay much for lodging," Evelyn admitted. "I spent nearly everything getting here." "We'll figure something out," Ethel said. "I could use help with the books and the cleaning. These old hands aren't what they used to be." Through the window, Evelyn watched the townspeople going about their business. Some glanced toward the boarding house with obvious disapproval. Others seemed to have already forgotten about her arrival entirely. "They think I'll be gone by morning," Evelyn said quietly. Ethel joined her at the window. What they think and what actually happens are often two different things entirely. This town's had its share of surprises over the years. Below on the street, Silas Brooks emerged from the general store carrying supplies. He glanced up at the boarding house windows, his expression unreadable from the distance. "That one's full of surprises himself," Ethel murmured, following Evelyn's gaze. "Folks around here see what they expect to see, not what's actually there." As evening approached, Evelyn unpacked her few belongings and tried to make sense of her situation. She had no money for return passage to Philadelphia, no family waiting for her there anyway. The West had promised a new beginning, but so far it had delivered only humiliation and uncertainty. The question that would determine everything hung in the air like smoke from the evening cookfires. Would she find the strength to stay and fight for her place in this hostile territory? Or would tomorrow's stagecoach carry her away from Copper Ridge forever? 3 days passed in Copper Ridge like slow torture. Evelyn helped Ethel with the boarding house duties, but the townspeople's hostility followed her everywhere. Children threw pebbles when she walked to the general store. Women crossed the street to avoid her path. Men made crude comments just loud enough for her to hear. Jedediah Cole's influence spread like poison through the community. He told anyone who would listen that Evelyn represented everything wrong with changing times. His voice carried weight in a town where economic survival depended on his favor. "That woman's bringing shame on our decent community," Cole declared from his usual spot outside the saloon. "Decent folks shouldn't have to look at such deception every day." The pressure mounted with each passing hour. Even Ethel faced consequences for harboring the unwelcome visitor. 3 regular boarders packed their belongings and left without explanation. The general store owner refused to extend credit for basic supplies. Evelyn found herself questioning every decision that had brought her to this hostile place. The letters from Philadelphia in her trunk offered no comfort now. Her younger brother's final correspondence before his death had encouraged her western journey. He would have been heartbroken to see how it was unfolding. On the 4th morning, she ventured toward the schoolhouse, hoping to find work as a teacher. The town needed educated people, and her experience in Philadelphia should have qualified her for the position. Instead, she found a group of children tormenting a smaller boy behind the building. The boy cowered against the wooden wall while 3 older children shouted at him. Their words made no sense to Evelyn until she realized they were mocking his attempts to communicate. The child was deaf. "Leave him alone," she called out, approaching the group. The older children scattered like startled birds, leaving the deaf boy pressed against the schoolhouse wall. Tears streaked his dirty cheeks as he tried to form words with his hands. Evelyn's heart stopped. She recognized the gestures immediately. Her hands moved without conscious thought, forming the signs she had learned years ago in Philadelphia. The boy's eyes widened as she asked in sign language if he was hurt. His small hands trembled as he responded, telling her the other children called him stupid because he couldn't speak properly. His name was Timothy, and he lived with his grandmother on the edge of town. "You're not stupid," Evelyn signed back. "You're just speaking a different language." Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Evelyn turned to find Silas Brooks walking toward them, his massive frame casting a shadow over the scene. She expected him to pass by as he usually did, acknowledging her presence with only a brief nod. Instead, Silas knelt beside Timothy and began moving his hands in fluid, practiced gestures. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Silas was signing with perfect clarity, asking Timothy what had happened and if he needed help getting home. The boy's face lit up with relief and joy. He signed rapidly, telling Silas about the bullying and how grateful he was that someone else understood him. Silas glanced at Evelyn with surprise in his dark eyes. Few people in Copper Ridge knew sign language. The discovery that this rejected mail-order bride shared his silent world sent shockwaves through his carefully guarded heart. "You know the hand language," Evelyn signed to Silas, her movements rusty but clear. "I learned as a child," he signed back. "Fever took my hearing and voice when I was young. They returned partially over the years, but I found silence served me better." Timothy watched their exchange with fascination. For the first time in his young life, he witnessed two adults communicating in his language with fluency and respect. "Most people think I'm simple because I don't speak," Silas continued, his large hands forming the signs with surprising grace. "They say things around me they would never say otherwise." Evelyn understood immediately. Silas had been invisible to the townspeople for years, dismissed as a harmless giant with limited intelligence. His silence had made him the perfect observer of their secrets and cruelties. "What have you seen?" she asked through gestures. Silas glanced around to ensure they were alone before responding. "More than they realize. This town has problems deeper than their treatment of you." Timothy tugged at Evelyn's skirt and signed that his grandmother was looking for him. Silas offered to walk the boy home, and Timothy nodded eagerly. As they walked through the dusty streets, Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, she had found genuine connection. Not just with Timothy, who needed advocates in his silent world, but with Silas, whose perceived simplicity masked sharp intelligence and careful observation. The three of them made an unlikely group: the rejected bride, the silent giant, and the deaf child. Yet their shared language created an intimacy that transcended the harsh judgments of the surrounding community. At Timothy's small house on the outskirts of town, his grandmother emerged with worry creasing her weathered face. She thanked Silas in spoken words and gestures, clearly accustomed to communicating with her grandson's limitations. "These two understand Timothy's hand-talking," Silas said aloud, his voice rusty from disuse but clear enough to be understood. The grandmother's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Few people had ever bothered to learn Timothy's language or treat him with dignity. Walking back toward town, Evelyn and Silas continued their silent conversation. She learned that his observations had revealed corruption and cruelty that went far beyond her own experience. He had been documenting injustices for years, waiting for someone who might help him act on the knowledge. "Why haven't you spoken up before?" she asked through careful signs. "Who would listen to the mute giant?" he responded. "But you have education. You have words they might hear." Their hands moved in the ancient dance of sign language, building trust and understanding that neither had expected to find in this harsh place. The connection growing between them had nothing to do with physical attraction or conventional courtship. It was recognition. Two souls who had been dismissed and underestimated finding strength in their shared experience of invisibility. As they reached the boarding house, Evelyn realized her situation in Copper Ridge had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a rejected bride with no prospects. She was part of something larger, more important than marriage arrangements or social acceptance. The question now was whether their newfound alliance could survive the forces already moving against them. Word of Evelyn's connection with Silas and Timothy spread through Copper Ridge like wildfire. The sight of three outcasts communicating in hand language sparked fresh gossip and deeper suspicion. Jedediah Cole's anger intensified as he watched his narrative of righteous rejection crumble. "Now she's corrupting the simple folk," Cole declared to anyone who would listen. "First she deceives honest men. Now she's filling heads with strange ideas." But something unexpected was happening in the quiet corners of town. Families who had dismissed Evelyn began seeking her help with problems they couldn't solve alone. Her education and organizational skills proved invaluable to people struggling with failed crops and mounting debts. Martha Stevens arrived at the boarding house with tears in her eyes and a stack of confusing papers. Her husband had died the previous winter, leaving behind financial documents she couldn't understand. The bank threatened foreclosure on their small ranch. Evelyn spread the papers across Ethel's kitchen table and began sorting through the mess. Her experience keeping books in Philadelphia served her well. Within hours, she had identified errors in the bank's calculations and found proof of payments the institution claimed never happened. "They're stealing from you," Evelyn told Martha. "These numbers don't add up." Martha's relief turned to anger as she realized the scope of the deception. Word spread quickly that the rejected bride had saved the Stevens ranch from illegal seizure. More families followed. The widow Johnson needed help negotiating with suppliers who were overcharging for basic goods. The Miller family couldn't understand why their land taxes had tripled overnight. Each case revealed patterns of exploitation targeting the most vulnerable residents. Silas watched these developments with growing concern. Through sign language, he shared information that chilled Evelyn's blood. The corruption went far deeper than simple overcharging and accounting errors. "There's a man named Marcus Whitfield," Silas explained through fluid gestures during one of their evening meetings behind the schoolhouse. "He's been buying up land through false documents and intimidation." Evelyn's hands moved carefully as she responded. "What kind of false documents?" "Survey reports that claim property boundaries different from the original grants. Death certificates for people who are still alive. Legal papers that transfer ownership without proper signatures." The scope of the conspiracy became clearer with each revelation. Silas had been observing these crimes for months, his perceived mental limitations making him invisible to the perpetrators. They spoke freely around him, assuming he lacked the intelligence to understand their schemes. "Timothy's father was the original surveyor for this territory," Silas continued. "He disappeared last spring after refusing to sign false boundary reports." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Disappeared how?" "His horse came back without him. They said he fell in the canyon, but his body was never found. Timothy's grandmother believes he was murdered for his honesty." The pieces of a larger puzzle began fitting together in Evelyn's mind. The land grabs, the financial pressure on vulnerable families, the systematic exploitation of people who lacked education or legal representation. Someone was orchestrating a comprehensive theft of the territory's resources. Cole's hostility toward her made perfect sense now. Her presence threatened more than social order. Her skills threatened their criminal enterprise. "They're afraid of what you represent," Silas signed. "An educated person who can read their documents and expose their lies." Their secret meetings continued nightly, hidden by darkness and the assumption that neither posed any real threat. Silas shared years of accumulated observations, while Evelyn organized the information into coherent patterns of criminal activity. The deaf child Timothy became an unexpected ally. His silence made adults forget his presence, and his sharp eyes caught details others missed. He had seen men moving through his father's surveying equipment the night before the disappearance. He had watched strangers plant documents in his father's office. Through sign language, Timothy provided crucial details about the conspiracy. His information confirmed Silas's observations and filled gaps in their understanding of the criminal network. But their investigation attracted dangerous attention. Cole began spreading rumors about improper relations between Evelyn and Silas. The whispers painted their friendship as something shameful and inappropriate. The fact that they communicated through hand language only fueled speculation about secret activities. "Decent folks don't sneak around in the dark having silent conversations," Cole proclaimed from his platform outside the saloon. "Who knows what kind of wickedness they're planning?" Marcus Whitfield arrived in town during the third week of Evelyn's stay. A well-dressed man with cold eyes and expensive boots, he conducted business from the hotel and met privately with Cole and other influential residents. Silas recognized him immediately as the man who had ordered Timothy's father to falsify survey documents. His presence meant the conspiracy was entering a new phase. "He's here to finish what they started," Silas explained through urgent gestures. "The land grabs are about to accelerate." Whitfield wasted no time asserting his authority. He produced legal documents claiming ownership of several properties, including the boarding house where Evelyn stayed. The papers appeared legitimate, complete with official seals and proper signatures. But Evelyn's trained eye caught discrepancies that others missed. The dates didn't align properly. The legal language contained subtle errors that suggested forgery. Most telling of all, one signature belonged to Timothy's missing father, supposedly written weeks after his disappearance. "These documents are fraudulent," she told Ethel that evening, "but proving it will be dangerous." The stakes had escalated beyond personal survival. If Whitfield succeeded in his land grab, dozens of families would lose their homes and livelihoods. The entire community faced destruction at the hands of organized criminals who operated with apparent legal authority. Ethel's boarding house became an unofficial headquarters for resistance. Families gathered in the kitchen after dark, sharing information and planning their response to the growing threat. Evelyn's organizational skills and Silas's intelligence network created the foundation for coordinated action, but time was running short. Whitfield had already begun eviction proceedings against several families. The corrupt sheriff enforced his orders without question, leaving the victims with no legal recourse through normal channels. The moment of decisive action was approaching. Either the conspiracy would succeed in its systematic theft, or the unlikely alliance of outcasts would find a way to expose the truth before Copper Ridge fell completely under criminal control. Everything depended on whether courage could triumph over corruption in the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory. The crisis erupted on a scorching Tuesday morning when Sheriff Morrison arrived at Ethel's boarding house with eviction papers. Marcus Whitfield stood beside him, his expensive suit immaculate despite the desert heat. Behind them, Cole smirked with obvious satisfaction. "You've got 1 hour to clear out," Morrison announced, waving the official documents. "This property now belongs to the Territorial Development Company." Ethel's hands shook as she examined the papers. The legal language was complex and intimidating, but the message was clear. Her family's boarding house, operated for 20 years, was being seized under eminent domain. "There's no railroad coming through here," Ethel protested. "This makes no sense." "Plans change," Whitfield said smoothly. "Progress requires difficult decisions sometimes." Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her trained eye immediately catching the flaws in the documentation. The signatures were too perfect, the dates suspicious, the legal references incorrect for territorial law. But challenging armed men with official badges required more than sharp eyes and good intentions. "This seems rather sudden," she said carefully. "Surely residents deserve proper notice for such major changes." Morrison's hand moved to his gun belt. "You got no standing in this matter, woman. Pack your belongings and move along." Word spread through town within minutes. Families gathered in the street to witness the confrontation, their faces showing fear rather than sympathy. If Whitfield could seize the boarding house so easily, no property was safe from his reach. Silas emerged from the crowd, his massive frame drawing immediate attention from the sheriff. Morrison had always been wary of the silent giant, uncertain whether his perceived simplicity masked potential danger. "Move along, Silas," the sheriff ordered. "This doesn't concern you." But Silas didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer to Evelyn, his presence a silent statement of solidarity that spoke louder than words. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by the gathered townspeople or the men enforcing the eviction. Timothy appeared at his grandmother's side, the old woman's weathered face showing recognition of the man who had ordered her son to falsify documents. Her eyes met Whitfield's with undisguised hatred, and he shifted uncomfortably under her stare. "Something wrong, Mrs. Patterson?" Whitfield asked, his tone deceptively casual. The old woman's voice carried across the silent crowd. "You look familiar. Remind me of someone who used to visit my boy before he disappeared." Dangerous currents ran beneath the surface of the confrontation. Too many people knew too much, and the balance of power hung by increasingly thin threads. That evening, Evelyn found herself homeless for the second time in 3 weeks. Ethel had secured temporary shelter with the Stevens family, but space was limited. Most townspeople were too frightened of Whitfield's retaliation to offer help. Silas appeared as darkness fell, gesturing for Evelyn to follow him. He led her to a small cabin on the outskirts of town, barely more than a shed, but clean and secure. Through sign language, he explained that he had built it himself as a workshop and storage space. "You can't stay here alone with me," Evelyn protested through gestures. "The talk would destroy whatever reputation I have left." "Your reputation is already destroyed by association with me," Silas responded. "At least, here you'll be safe while we plan our next move." In the privacy of the cabin, illuminated by a single oil lamp, Silas revealed the full extent of his secret knowledge. He produced a leather satchel filled with documents, maps, and detailed observations, accumulated over months of silent investigation. "I haven't been completely honest about who I am," he signed slowly. "My name isn't just Silas Brooks." Evelyn's heart hammered as she waited for his revelation. "I'm Silas Brooks Whitman. I used to be a federal land surveyor back in Kansas Territory." The name hit her like a physical blow. She had heard of the Whitman surveying scandal, where a federal employee had refused to falsify land records for corrupt officials and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. "They said you died," she gestured back. "They tried to kill me. Poison in my food caused the fever that took my hearing and voice. I barely escaped Kansas alive." The pieces of the larger conspiracy suddenly clicked into place. Whitfield wasn't just stealing land in Arizona Territory. He was part of a network that had been operating across the expanding frontier for years. "He's here because he knows I'm alive," Silas continued. "Timothy's father contacted federal authorities before his disappearance. If they connect me to those communications, we're all dead." Evelyn stared at the documents spread across the small table. Survey maps, correspondence between federal officials, evidence of bribes and intimidation stretching back years. Silas had been gathering proof, not just of local corruption, but of a conspiracy that reached territorial and federal levels. "Why haven't you sent this information east?" she asked. "Who would believe the word of a supposedly dead surveyor against men with political connections? I needed someone with credibility and intelligence to help organize the evidence properly." The weight of responsibility settled on Evelyn's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She possessed the education and organizational skills to make sense of the complex web of criminal activity. But using those skills would paint a target on her back that would never disappear. "If we expose this conspiracy, we'll have to leave Arizona Territory," Silas explained. "There's no future for us here once we make enemies of such powerful men." Through the cabin window, lights flickered in the distant town. Families were settling in for the night, unaware that their futures hung in the balance. Some would lose their homes and livelihoods if the conspiracy succeeded. Others might lose their lives if it was exposed. "What about Timothy and the other victims?" Evelyn asked through careful gestures. "They'll suffer either way, unless we act," Silas responded. "The question is whether we have the courage to risk everything for people who have shown us little kindness." The moral equation was clear, even if the practical considerations were terrifying. They could remain silent and allow the systematic theft to continue, or they could fight back, knowing the consequences might be fatal. Outside, coyotes howled in the desert darkness, their voices carrying across the empty landscape like warnings of dangers yet to come. Dawn broke with news that changed everything. Federal marshals had arrived on the overnight stage, their presence sending ripples of panic through Whitfield's network. Evelyn watched from the cabin window as armed men in official badges rode down Main Street with grim determination. Her carefully written letters had reached their destination. 3 weeks earlier, she had composed detailed reports to territorial authorities, documenting the land fraud with Silas's evidence. The response had taken longer than expected, but federal law enforcement had finally arrived to investigate her claims. Whitfield emerged from the hotel in obvious agitation, his usual composure cracking under pressure. Cole rushed to meet him, their heated conversation visible even from a distance. The conspiracy was unraveling faster than they could contain it. "They're going to blame everything on us," Silas signed urgently. "We need to reach the marshals before Whitfield spins his story." But their path to town was blocked. Sheriff Morrison and two deputies had positioned themselves between the cabin and Main Street, clearly under orders to prevent Silas and Evelyn from reaching the federal agents. The trap was closing from multiple directions. Whitfield needed scapegoats for his crimes, and the rejected mail-order bride and silent surveyor made perfect targets. Their accusations could be dismissed as revenge fantasies from bitter outcasts. Silas made a decision that surprised even himself. For the first time in years, he raised his voice and called out across the desert morning. His words were rusty, but clear enough to carry. Marshal Thompson. Federal Marshal Thompson. The sound of his voice after months of silence sent shockwaves through the watching deputies. They had never heard the supposed mute giant speak, and his knowledge of the marshal's name suggested connections they hadn't anticipated. One of the federal agents turned toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. Silas stepped into full view, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. "My name is Silas Brooks Whitman," he called out. "I'm a federal surveyor who was reported dead in Kansas Territory." The marshal's reaction was immediate and decisive. He spurred his horse toward the cabin, leaving his colleagues to handle the increasingly agitated Whitfield. Morrison and his deputies found themselves caught between conflicting authorities, uncertain which orders to follow. Within minutes, Marshal Thompson reached the cabin where Evelyn waited with the carefully organized evidence. Her methodical documentation had transformed Silas's scattered observations into a comprehensive case that painted a clear picture of criminal conspiracy. "Miss Thompson, I presume," the marshal said, tipping his hat respectfully. "Your letters were quite detailed and persuasive." Evelyn's heart swelled with an emotion she hadn't felt since arriving in Copper Ridge. Respect. Someone in authority was treating her as an intelligent person worthy of serious attention. "The evidence is all here," she said, indicating the documents spread across the table. "Mr. Whitman has been documenting these crimes for months." Marshal Thompson examined the papers with growing amazement. Survey maps with forged signatures, correspondence revealing bribery, financial records showing systematic theft. The case was more extensive than federal authorities had imagined possible. "We'll need both of you to testify," he told them. "This conspiracy reaches beyond Arizona territory into federal jurisdiction." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see Whitfield riding hard toward the cabin with Cole and several armed men behind him. The criminals had decided to eliminate the witnesses rather than face exposure. "Get behind me," Marshal Thompson ordered, drawing his weapon. But Silas had a different plan. He stepped outside the cabin and raised both hands above his head, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "Marcus Whitfield," he called out. "The federal marshals have all the evidence they need. Surrender now and save yourselves more trouble." Whitfield reined in his horse 20 yards away, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "You should have stayed dead, Whitman." "A lot of people should have done things differently," Silas replied. "Timothy Patterson's father should still be alive. Mrs. Stevens should still own her ranch. Ethel Remington should still have her boarding house." The confrontation drew spectators from town. Families emerged from their homes to witness the showdown between federal law enforcement and the men who had terrorized them for months. Their presence created additional pressure on all sides. Marshal Thompson appeared beside Silas, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. "Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and murder. Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully." The moment stretched like a taut wire. Whitfield's hand hovered near his gun while his followers waited for orders. Cole's usual bluster had evaporated, replaced by the pale fear of a man facing prison or worse. "You can't prove murder," Whitfield snarled. "Timothy Patterson saw you plant evidence in his father's office," Evelyn called out from the cabin doorway. "A deaf child whose testimony you never thought to worry about." The revelation struck like lightning. Whitfield's face went ashen as he realized the scope of evidence arrayed against him. His careful planning had failed to account for witnesses he had dismissed as irrelevant. Additional federal marshals appeared from concealment around the town, their strategic positioning making resistance futile. The conspiracy had been surrounded and outmaneuvered by superior preparation and legal authority. One by one, Whitfield's men lowered their weapons. The fight went out of them as they realized the hopelessness of their situation. Cole dismounted and stood with his hands raised, his political influence worthless against federal charges. "It's over," Marshal Thompson announced. "All of you are under arrest." The town of Copper Ridge erupted in cheers as handcuffs clicked around the wrists of their oppressors. Families who had lived in fear for months suddenly found their voices, calling out support for the federal agents and even for the unlikely pair who had made justice possible. Timothy ran toward the cabin with his grandmother close behind. Through rapid sign language, he expressed his joy that his father's killers would finally face punishment for their crimes. The morning sun climbed higher over the Arizona territory, illuminating a community transformed by courage and the persistent pursuit of truth. The trials lasted 3 weeks in the territorial courthouse. Evelyn's organized evidence proved devastating to Whitfield's defense. Her methodical documentation had transformed scattered observations into an ironclad legal case that exposed years of systematic criminal activity. Silas testified with quiet authority, his expertise as a federal surveyor lending credibility to technical evidence about forged documents and illegal land transfers. The jury listened with rapt attention as he explained how boundary markers had been moved and official records falsified. Timothy Patterson's testimony through sign language interpretation provided the emotional climax of the proceedings. The deaf child's account of witnessing men plant evidence in his father's office brought tears to the courtroom and sealed Whitfield's fate. The verdicts came swiftly. Whitfield received 20 years in territorial prison for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. Cole got 10 years for his role in the land grab scheme. Sheriff Morrison faced 5 years for corruption and abuse of office. Property rights were restored to their rightful owners throughout Copper Ridge. The Stevens Ranch was returned to Martha's control. Ethel Remington reclaimed her boarding house. Dozens of families discovered their legal ownership of land they had feared losing forever. But the most dramatic change came in how the community viewed Evelyn and Silas. The rejected mail-order bride and the silent giant had transformed from outcasts into heroes. Their courage in facing powerful enemies had saved the entire town from systematic theft. The territorial governor arrived for a special ceremony recognizing their service. He offered Silas reinstatement as a federal surveyor with a promotion and increased authority. The position would allow him to continue fighting land fraud across the expanding frontier. For Evelyn, the governor had an even more unprecedented offer. The territory needs qualified justices of the peace in remote communities. Your organizational skills and legal knowledge make you an ideal candidate. The appointment would make her the first woman to hold such a position in Arizona territory. The authority to perform marriages, settle disputes, and oversee legal proceedings represented a level of respect she had never imagined possible. "I accept," she said without hesitation. The community that had once rejected her now celebrated her appointment. Families who had benefited from her assistance organized a reception in her honor. Even former skeptics acknowledged her intelligence and moral authority. Ethel beamed with pride as she watched the transformation. "I told you this town was full of surprises. Sometimes it just takes the right person to bring out the best in folks." Silas found himself facing choices he had never expected. His federal position would require extensive travel throughout the territory, investigating fraud cases and establishing proper survey standards. The work was important, but would separate him from Copper Ridge for months at a time. Through sign language during their private conversations, he and Evelyn discussed their uncertain future. Their partnership had grown from shared adversity into something deeper and more enduring. "I don't want to leave you behind," he signed one evening as they sat outside the boarding house. "Then don't," she responded with gestures full of quiet determination. Their courtship had been unlike any other in the territory's history, built on mutual respect rather than physical attraction, sustained by shared purpose rather than romantic sentiment. The connection forged through sign language had created intimacy that transcended conventional relationships. The proposal came naturally during one of their silent conversations. Silas asked through careful gestures if she would consider marriage to a man whose work would take him away frequently, but whose heart would always return to her. Evelyn's response was equally practical and heartfelt. She would marry him if he understood that her justice work might sometimes conflict with his federal duties. Their partnership would require constant negotiation and mutual support. The wedding took place 2 months after the trials ended. The ceremony was conducted in both spoken English and sign language, allowing Timothy and other deaf community members to participate fully. Marshall Thompson served as best man, while Ethel acted as matron of honor. Nearly the entire population of Copper Ridge attended the celebration. The same people who had once mocked Evelyn's arrival now cheered her marriage to the man who had seen her true worth from the beginning. Timothy beamed with joy as he watched the couple exchange vows through gestures he could understand. His grandmother wept with happiness, knowing her grandson finally had advocates who would fight for his dignity and rights. The reception featured music, dancing, and speeches celebrating the transformation of their community. Former enemies had become allies. Outcasts had become leaders. Fear had been replaced by hope for a more just future. As evening approached, Evelyn and Silas stepped outside for a quiet moment together. The desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors while the sounds of celebration continued behind them. "No regrets about the mail-order bride arrangement that brought you here?" Silas asked aloud, his voice stronger now with regular use. "None whatsoever," Evelyn replied. "Sometimes the worst rejections lead to the best destinations." Their first assignment as a married couple would take them to a remote mining town where similar land fraud was suspected. Together, they would establish legal precedents protecting vulnerable communities throughout the territory. Timothy ran toward them across the dusty yard, his hands moving rapidly in excited sign language. He had been accepted into a special school for deaf children in Phoenix, with full scholarships arranged through Evelyn's connections with territorial officials. The boy's bright future symbolized the changes spreading through Arizona territory. Justice was replacing corruption. Understanding was overcoming prejudice. Courage was defeating fear. As stars appeared in the darkening sky above Copper Ridge, Evelyn and Silas began planning their next mission. Their partnership would continue serving communities that needed advocates with the wisdom to see beyond appearances and the strength to fight for what was right. The rejected mail-order bride had found her true calling, and the silent cowboy had found his voice. Together, they would help build a territory where justice spoke louder than prejudice, and love conquered all forms of discrimination.